So I wrote up a response, but I'm not going to read it just because you can read it. It's on my website. But I will just kind of extrapolate a little bit some of the key points I made there. I want to suggest that I take two stances here. The weak argument is that integralists should at least become more informed about what capitalism is, and that we have actually a completely kind of under-interrogated, under-theorized conception of capitalism, and the forms of capitalism that we talk about, integral capitalism, yada, yada, it mostly ignores the entire tradition of heterodox economics. And so I think once we have a more comprehensive view of the nature of the capitalist economy, then I get to my stronger argument, which is that when you understand the dynamics of capitalism, it becomes clear that if you stick to the principles of integral theory and of integral meta theories more broadly, and especially people like Bhaskar, then we should be, if we're committed to our own principles, at the very least post-capitalist and potentially actually anti-capitalist. And so when people say the anti-capitalist movement is a green meme phenomenon, to me they're using green meme and terms like second tier as substitutions for actual thought. Right? We need to actually think through what's going on in these movements and spend time dialoguing with them in their most sophisticated forms and not using developmental theory as a way essentially to dismiss them and not listen to them. So I'm going to say the strong argument is the one that I'm going to propose today just because this is a polarized debate. So, of course, to think about how capitalism works more deeply, we need to get into a bunch of complex theories in economics, including the nature of money, the nature of value theory, right? And I'm not going to get into that today, but we can. But I think what I want to say here is that the principles of integral theory talk often about transcending and including. But I think there's a basic confusion in there between enduring and transitional structures, right? So that's one issue here. So you can think about transcending capitalism, but negating and preserving it, as opposed to transcending but including it in its entirety. So that's, I think, one of the sticking points here is we think as developmentalists we need to always transcend and include, and to be integral you can't be anti-anything. But in fact, to be integral you're anti a lot, and we need to admit that. You know, I'm anti-injustice, right? I don't transcend and include injustice. I get rid of injustice, right? So the idea that there's this inclusiveness that includes everything becomes a problem. And so I love integral theory because of its inclusiveness, but we need to become more articulate about what it means to be opposed to things and to speak, you know, and to take power and to use force occasionally when necessary, to be opposed to things and not to find ways to rationalize and justify them, right? So I think there's an underlying issue here about strategy versus compromise, right? And I'm not going to get into that, but hopefully we'll have a chance to get into that. But it's key to think about here the conscious capitalism movement and what that means and the degree to which that is a compromise or a strategy, right? So to preempt my kind of integrative comments, I would say something along the lines of conscious capitalism should be seen as a gateway drug to an actually post-capitalist form of intoxication, social intoxication, right? So to that extent, I'm not opposed to conscious capitalism, but I am opposed to a form of conscious capitalism that sees no alternative to capitalism, right? And that's exactly what I'm going to use that term occasionally, the man, that's what they want you to think, that there is no alternative, that somehow capitalism is actually a naturally occurring thing, that markets are like nature. And you watch David Attenborough, and David Attenborough says on the BBC nature programs that the flower is entrepreneurial and exploits the bee to have it. And what you see is that we're actually so ingrained in our ideology that we weed backwards into nature and posit the social system we saw. And when Darwin came with the theory of evolution, it was Charles Sanders Peirce who said, this is nothing but the gospel of greed, right? So we naturalize capitalism, and we can't see beyond it. And it's a failure of imagination. There's also worth saying that capitalism is, by its nature, and I'm using this term and I haven't defined it, but one of the things that defines it by my definition is that it cannot imagine its own eternity, which is to say that it's a form of social organization that runs up against limits inevitably. The greatest example is the pursuit of endless profit, especially compounding rates of profit. And if you know anything about compounding rates of growth, they are radically unsustainable on a limited playing field, right? And so as soon as you say, well, capitalism isn't about the endless pursuit of profit, then I'm saying you're talking about something else and not capitalism, right? And that's fine, and we can have that debate. But the way capitalism is structured and what it means to cater to corporate interests is to help those corporations turn a profit. And then you get into value theory and you think, where does excess money come from? Where does surplus value come from? It comes from the exploitation of labor, primarily. And we can debate that, but I will stick pretty closely to that. So the reason we don't have robot factories, because you don't make money through technological innovation in the long run, because everyone can build that. You make money by having access to exploitable labor. And this is the main reason that we have corporations of global scope that can push nation states around. And it's primarily so that we can find ways to exploit labor. But there's only so long that there are peasant populations that can be brought into the urbanized industrial system and made into the wage laborers that they have become. There's only so much peasant labor that we can eventually include into the system, which means that that's another limit to capitalist growth, is that eventually we'll have to stop exploiting people. Profits rates will decline, right? The last thing I'll say is that there's an intrinsic relationship between markets and violence. And the idea that a market is a naturally occurring phenomenon has never existed in history. And if you look at the history of markets, what you see is that wherever there's a market, there's somebody with a gun or stick, right? So the nature of the relationship between capitalism and violence cannot be ignored. And the escalation of violence on a global scale has everything to do with the nature of the capitalist kind of reorganization that began in the wake of 1972 and the neoliberal counter-revolution.